So, fracture. Charting the complicated relationship and shifting power dynamics among three leaders, Reid shows how the interpersonal politics, along with individual strategies, ambitions, and responses to events such as Ferguson, have influenced decisions and policies, which in turn have shaped and reshaped the Democratic Party. This book traces the Democratic Party's turbulent racial history and the rocky road its candidates and elected presidents have trod on their way to reconciling their party and their country's past with its increasingly diverse future. It also explores how race can affect the crucial 2016 election and the future of America itself. A 2003 Knight Center for Specialized Journalism Fellow, Joy Ann Reid is the host of the Reid Report on weekdays at 2 p.m. on MSNBC. Was the host. She was the host. She is the former managing editor of thegrio.com, a daily online news and opinion platform devoted to delivering stories and perspectives that reflect and affect African American audiences. During the 2004 presidential campaign, Reid served as the Florida Deputy Communications Director for the 527 America Coming Together initiative and was a press aide in the final stretch of President Barack Obama's Florida campaign in 2008. She is currently producing a documentary, The Fight Years, which takes a look into the sport of boxing during the 1950s and 1960s in Miami. So please help me welcome Ms. Joy Ann Reid.
Thank you, Marquise. And thank you all for coming. I just saw some friends here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Marquise, also, of course, to Brad and Lissa. It is really great to be here. Now, I've never done anything like this before, this kind of a book talk thing, so please be patient. I'm a little nervous, but I figure if J.K. Rowling can do it, damn it, I can do it too. Also want to say thank you to WHUT and the team who is over there, Maurice, as well as Ebony and future author Rachel, who are over there and did a little interview with me earlier. So we're supporting our young people as they're starting to get into the profession. It's a jungle out there. I'm just letting you know. You're getting into the media, but we support you. Okay, so thank you all for being here. So just really quickly before I read a little bit from the book, I'll just say that the reason that I decided to write this book back in 2013 is when I first pitched it to HarperCollins was I felt that because we have, as a country, have crossed this milestone, this Rubicon of electing the first African-American president, I was interested in the question of what that means for the country and where we sort of are on the issue of race. Does it mean that, racism is over? Does it mean that race is no longer something that we have to discuss or debate? Does it mean that we've put kind of the period or the exclamation point on it? Or does it mean that we still have some complexities to work out? And my conclusion after a year and a half of interviewing lots and lots and lots of people and research and writing and editing and the whole process is that the latter is true, that we still have issues that need to be worked out, some of which were drawn out by the election of Barack Obama. So I'm going to read a little bit. It's only 8 pages. It won't be too long, and then we'll open it up if you guys have comments and questions too. Okay, here we go. Doing my J.K. Rowling without the accent. Here we go. Dating back to the earliest days of the campaign, a dark vein of resistance to Obama's candidacy due to his race arose periodically. There was former Democratic vice presidential candidate Geraldine Ferraro's comment that Obama would never have been in a position to defeat Hillary Clinton had he not been black. Republican Congressman Jeff Davis of Kentucky said, "That boy's finger does not need to be on the button." A California Republican women's group issued gag currency they called Obama Bucks, food stamp send-ups with Obama's head on the body of a donkey surrounded by spare ribs, Kool-Aid, and fried chicken. And Buck Burnett, a University of Texas Longhorns lineman, updated his Facebook status after the election to declare, "All the hunters gather up. We have a nigger in the White House." Michelle Obama, so celebrated in the national press, was subjected to the basest racial distortions. She was depicted in online memes as an unfeminine brute and beast, derided in conservative columns as a dangerous, whitey-hating, America-loathing radical. The term Obama's baby mama was used on Fox News, and the National Review called her Mrs. Grievance. The attacks didn't end with the election, and even I'm missing a page. And even the Obama girls, just 7 and 10 years old when their father took the oath of office, wouldn't be spared. But the new president found himself under a microscope calibrated to detect any hint that he was reacting to the slings and arrows of national politics from the perspective of a black man. The attacks on him and his family had to be borne with a special type of dignity. Every president before him had borne some measure of ridicule, parody, and hatred. The reasoning would go, why not him? Why should attacks on him be especially scrutinized for racist intent? Barack Obama had burst onto the national stage by transcending race and by practicing consistent and convincing racial ecumenism. The onus was on him and his African-American first family to represent America's racial progress and to be the Cosby Show Huxtables in real life. Even Mrs. Obama's mother, Marion Robinson, who in 2009 moved from her Chicago home to the White House to help care for the couple's young daughters, a move not without precedent, from the mother-in-law of President John Tyler to the father-in-law of Benjamin Harrison to multiple family members of Andrew Jackson, was under constant scrutiny. One false policy move, untoward word, or flash of anger would snap the hair trigger of skepticism about whether the real first black president truly did represent all Americans and not just his own people. Any black politician elected outside a safely black district knew the rules for staying racially neutral. They had been around for decades, though this was the first time they were being applied to a president of the United States. 1 month into the nation administration, Eric Holder broke the rules. On February 18, a cartoon in the New York Post lampooned the nearly $1 trillion economic recovery package rejected by Republicans and passed almost entirely by Democrats. The Post cartoon referred to the horrific news story of a Connecticut woman who had been mauled by a pet chimpanzee. In the cartoon, 2 police officers stand over the body of a blood-spattered dead primate. They'll have to find someone else to write the next stimulus bill, the caption read. The cartoon drew immediate outrage as it flew across the internet. Reverend Sharpton issued a statement denouncing it as troubling at best, given the historic racist attacks on African Americans as being synonymous with monkeys. New York Governor David Paterson called on the paper to explain. The Post, owned by conservative mogul Rupert Murdoch, whose international media empire includes Fox News, was a longtime opponent of Democrats, local and national, and had sparred with Sharpton for decades. Its editor vigorously defended the comic as mocking the stimulus package and not the president. But for African Americans, it read as the kind of bestializing that black men and women had been subjected to for centuries, written off as comedy to many on the right, but touching a deep vein of ugly historic memory in black minds and souls. On the day the cartoon ran, Holder was giving his first Black History Month address to the staff at the Justice Department. His speech touched on historic memory, too, and on the inability of black and white Americans to confront it equally. Holder, a former judge and deputy attorney general during the Clinton administration, had joined other Clinton veterans, such as David Wilhelm, Susan Rice, and Patrick Gaspard, in choosing Obama over Hillary in the Democratic primaries. He became a senior legal advisor to the campaign of a man he'd met roughly a year before. Unlike Obama, who proceeded on matters of race with cautious deliberation, Holder, the son of Barbadian parents who raised their 2 boys in the mostly black middle-class suburb of Elmhurst, Queens, had the bearing of an activist. 10 years older than Obama and with a New Yorker's pugnaciousness, he often recounted the time he was stopped by police while sprinting through an upscale neighborhood with a friend trying to make the start of a movie. At the time, he happened to be a federal prosecutor. Holder's Justice Department speech was expansive, touching on the 50th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, integration, affirmative action, and the broad civil rights movement. He spoke of his late sister-in-law, Vivian Malone Jones, one of the 2 black students to face down Governor George Wallace to integrate the University of Alabama in 1963. And he talked about the need to heal communities long scarred by crime and mistrust with police. But Holder began his speech with a damning assessment of the state of interracial dialogue. It landed like a fully armed rocket when it reached the national media. Though this nation has proudly thought of itself as an ethnic melting pot, the Attorney General said, in things racial, we have always been and continue to be in too many ways, essentially a nation of cowards. Holder went on to explain that unresolved issues of race remain front and center in America's politics and culture, though we, average Americans, simply do not talk enough with each other about race. It is an issue we have never been at ease with, and given our nation's history, this is in some ways understandable. And yet, if we are to make progress in this area, we must feel comfortable enough with one another and tolerant enough of each other to have frank conversations about the racial matters that continue to divide us. Within hours, conservative blogs were denouncing Holder and trying to use his presence as the Attorney General and Obama's as president, and even Martin Luther King Day, as proof that the nation had paid its racial debts. But these were some of the same voices insisting that a monkey cartoon lampooning the first black president was just a monkey cartoon. The White House was caught off guard by the outcry over Holder's speech. The new administration had no intention of wading into racial conflict, preferring to keep the president focused on the needs of all Americans and principally on the economy. Anything that racialized the Obama presidency was unwelcome in the West Wing. Asked about Holder's comments by New York Times reporter Helene Cooper in early March, Obama said that had he been advising his attorney general, we would have used different language. Obama concurred with the underlying point of Holder's speech, saying, we're oftentimes uncomfortable with talking about race until there's some sort of racial flare-up or conflict. And as a country, we could probably be more constructive in facing up to sort of the painful legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and discrimination. But Obama was quick to pivot to a focus on the nation's progress. I'm not somebody who believes that constantly talking about race somehow solves racial problems, he said. I think what solves racial tension is fixing the economy, putting people to work, making sure that people have health care, ensuring that every kid is learning out there. I think if we do that, then we'll probably have more fruitful conversations. Whatever the president's annoyance over the bluntness of the attorney general's words, Holder had exposed a truth that to black Americans seemed both obvious and glaring. Their countrymen too often ease their discomfort over racial disparities by ignoring the subject of race altogether, except on those occasions when it sputters and spills out in ugly emails and Facebook posts, gag food stamps with Barack Obama's picture on them, ugly rally signs, and unfortunate newspaper cartoons. His speech earned him widespread acclaim among African Americans who quickly took notice of the Attorney General. And Holder had strong supporters inside the White House, including Gaspard and Jarrett and the president himself. He had no intention of walking his comments back. On the contrary, Holder would continue to be a lightning rod. From the start, the new Attorney General had stated his determination to revive the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, which had become moribund and dispirited under the previous administration. There have been large numbers of resignations as pressure mounted to pursue mythic voter fraud and what many longtime division lawyers viewed as politicized partisan cases. Holder put an end to that quest in a bid to revive what he saw as the department's original mission, safeguarding voters from impediments to access to the polls, vigorously responding to alleged violations of the Voting Rights Act as the country headed toward a new census and a fresh round of federal and state gerrymandering. An admirer of Nicholas Katzenbach, Robert Kennedy's successor, who was Attorney General, brought federal troops to Alabama and personally faced down Governor Wallace to break the infamous stand at the schoolhouse door. Holder saw his role as grounded in Katzenbach's example, protecting vulnerable citizens from the caprice of state power by bringing federal authorities to bear. Holder had his critics on the left who thought he and the president did not vigorously pursue the titans of Wall Street who had brought about the collapse of the economy. They also blamed him for not surmounting congressional opposition to the closing of the prison camp at Guantanamo Bay and for his failure to secure federal prosecution for accused terrorists imprisoned there. Those criticisms were a source of deep frustration for Holder, who determined early on that there were no strong cases to bring against Wall Street bankers. But for civil rights leaders, he was an immediate friend. By the summer of 2009, Democrats had claimed their 60-vote majority in the Senate after resolving the seat in Minnesota, where a lawsuit by his opponent forced Al Franken to wait until July 7th to take his seat. And once Biden and Obama's seats in Delaware and Illinois were filled, the latter ending in the indictment of the state's governor. However, Republicans had honed their strategy of total obstruction, calling upon the same device segregationist Democrats once used in order to stall civil rights legislation, the filibuster. It was in those months that the health care bill, an Obama priority since the campaign, was making its way slowly, painfully, and publicly through the Senate. The president's opponents soon had the perfect vehicle to exploit the tortured process for political gain. The day after Holder's Nation of Cowards speech, a former hedge fund manager and commodities trader from Chicago, Rick Santelli, launched into an extended rant on CNBC, denouncing what he saw as Obama's mortgage bailout, in which the financial industry would be forced to write down the amounts due on mortgages that had ballooned far beyond the value of the homes they were tied to. The policy, called cram down, had been a key request of the administration from progressive and civil rights groups. The big banks, not surprisingly, were vehemently opposed. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise your hand, Santelli raged, vilifying deadbeat homeowners. President Obama, are you listening? The rant went viral, punctuated by Santelli's call for a July 4th Chicago Tea Party. The swelling opposition from the right to everything the president was doing, from financial reform to health care, now had a name. And while the origins of the Tea Party movement had roots in Chicago's libertarian movement dating back to 2002, Santelli popularized it and aimed the laser straight at Obama. Coincidentally, the president's chief economic advisors, Timothy Geithner and Larry Summers, were counseling the White House away from the actions the financial industry was so up in arms about. And as a result, the president was getting heat from the left because he seemed to avoid progressive solutions to the housing crisis. Liberals were learning that they may have underestimated the extent to which Obama's pragmatism outweighed his idealism. As the White House and Democrats in Congress moved toward passage of the health care bill, the road got increasingly ugly as town hall meetings turned raucous. Tea Party protesters claimed the president was secretly planning death panels to discard the elderly and disabled, cried socialism, and carried homemade signs comparing Obama with African witch doctors and Adolf Hitler. And in the midst of it all, the president followed Holder into the thicket of racial outrage. On July 16, a Cambridge, Massachusetts police officer arrested Henry Louis Gates, an Obama friend and the head of Harvard's Department of African American Studies. Gates had accidentally locked himself out of his home and was attempting to gain entry when a neighbor called 911 to report a possible break-in. Gates became angry when Sergeant James Crowley didn't believe he lived in the home and removed him from his porch in handcuffs. And though the Cambridge Police Department later dropped disorderly conduct charges against the professor, the officer refused to apologize, saying he had followed proper procedures. The local police union stood firmly behind Crowley, even as Gates threatened to sue. At a July 22nd primetime press conference, Obama responded to a question about the incident. Now, I don't know, not having been there, not seeing all the facts, what role race played, but I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would have been pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home. And number three, what I think we know separate and apart from this incident is that there's a long history in this country of African Americans and Latinos being stopped by law enforcement disproportionately. That's just a fact. President Obama was speaking off the cuff and as Gates' friend, but he had broken the rules of comportment, particularly for a man who had billed himself as a practitioner of racial healing, not racial confrontation. His comments set off an immediate firestorm. Conservative commentators accused the president of race baiting and of an outrageous attack on law enforcement. For the first time in his political career, Barack Obama was discovering what it was like to be Al Sharpton. The speed and vehemence of the uproar shocked the White House. They had come to Washington prepared to fight on the familiar ground of spending and taxation and to engage in the battles that were necessary to pass health care reform. But Obama had not intended to light any bonfires on race as president. In an attempt at healing, a summit was hastily arranged for the next week, in which Crowley and Gates would sit for a photo opportunity in the Rose Garden with the president and Vice President Biden, who during the fall campaign served as a key validator for Obama with white blue-collar voters. The goal of this beer summit, as it came to be known, was to create a patina of national healing. The teachable moment was punctuated by exhortations about disagreeing without being disagreeable. As political theater, it was pure Barack Obama, the very picture of Midwestern moderation and probity. But the damage was already done. A Pew poll taken 5 days after the press conference showed that Obama's approval rating among white Americans had slipped from 53% to 46%. while the approval of non-white and or Hispanic Americans climbed 11 points from 63 to 74%. African Americans thought Obama had spoken truth to a power many found onerous and omnipresent, the police. He'd also exposed the reality of racial profiling, even of a man who'd done everything right, becoming educated and successful and affluent. And Obama had done the exposing from the pulpit of the presidency, which gave his exhortations a power they had never known. It was cathartic, particularly coming from a man who up to this point had been so measured in his public pronouncements on race. The Pew poll also found that white Americans blamed Gates more than Crowley for the incident by 7 percentage points, and overwhelmingly disapproved of the president's handling of the incident by a margin of 2-1. Of those white Americans who heard a lot about the incident, the level of disapproval was 70% versus 23% approval. And it was just 6 months into his presidency, and Obama's racial honeymoon was over. His opponents on the right felt this proved that Obama was no racial healer. He was just another race-hustling divider who never had any intention of being everybody's president. The White House team absorbed a lesson that Bill Clinton had learned a generation earlier with the uproar over his apologies during his African trip. For even a post-racial president, touching the electrified rail of race bears exquisite peril. It was a lesson that would reverberate within the administration for years to come. That is all I'm going to read. Oh, stay up here? Okay, so I'll stay up here. And the reason I chose that passage, I thought, it isn't all about the Democrats. And the book really does deal a lot with some of the fissures on the Democratic side. But you can't write about race in the Obama administration without, of course, writing about the opposition, which definitely came in to the Obama era with a plan that had to do with making him a one-term president, making him an asterisk, and making sure that he couldn't succeed. And while that was not all explicitly racial, some of the specific attacks on him became really racial really quickly. And I did that timeline to show just how really quickly it was. We're talking about a 6-month period in which Eric Holder already had drawn the ire of people within months of Barack Obama taking office, and then he himself followed. So I think that race has provided an undercurrent and a context to the Obama presidency that even he didn't want, but that he was stuck with and that we're stuck with as a country. So I think it's something we can't escape, not the Democratic or the Republican Party can. And, we can talk about the Black Lives Matter, Bernie Sanders moment or any number of reasons why we are still not post-racial. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions? Be brave.
There are mics on either side of the pillars here. You can file up and...
Hello. You're tall, so you might need to...
Yeah. Well, I'm supposed to always start out by saying I'm not an American. I'm from the Caribbean. So, so I want to be very careful about what I'm saying about this issue. But I have a little bit of background in the whole Obama election. I was at, I'm not going to call the name of the university. I was at the university at that point in time doing my PhD in political science. And when he was elected, basically, all the white professors were completely enamored with the process, right? And it caused me to ask myself some questions, right? What was going on here? You guys should be a little bit more sophisticated to believe that this puts an end to racism and discrimination. So, but they were absolutely convinced that basically was done, right? Time to move on, shut up, and just move on, right? Being a Caribbean person, it's not really my main focus, but
right.
It's still my focus as part of the African diaspora. So let me ask you a question, because I'm very ambivalent about Obama, to be honest with you. Now, I hope this is never sent out in the Caribbean, and because my mother would be my mother would be extremely enraged with what I'm going to say now.
Right.
I really don't see much in Obama at all. When he was running, I told people, I saw African Americans totally in love with him. I said, this is going to be a big joke. He's going to be a big joke for you guys, and he's going to be, in my opinion, a very dangerous joke for you. Obama is useful as the white power structure has delegitimized itself to cover up a period of illegitimacy of the white power structure. But beyond that, I don't think you're going to get much out of him. I think I'm practically 100% correct in that. I may be wrong, but I think I'm quite correct in it. So I want to ask you something. I think there's a lot of love in the black community for Obama. Symbolic love and stuff like that. There can be underestimated. I'd say my mother, right? Mm-hmm. Is very much part of that. Don't you believe? And again, it's a complex issue, the Democratic Party and race. I mean, historically, right? Right? We don't even want to talk about that. Starting on the FDR, you got this kind of slow movement towards different things.
Okay,
But
yeah, we're getting to the question. The question's coming. I feel it. I feel it in my heart. My soul.
The question now is, don't you believe the role that Obama has played vis-a-vis the question of race and class, right? That has created tremendous problems for African Americans potentially moving forward, right? If you don't want to put pressure on him, when a white president's come in and blacks go to him and say you got to do something,
right.
and said do something to Obama.
Okay. Well, I mean, that. Yeah, no, I think that Barack Obama's election exposed things that were already there. I don't think that his being elected caused racial conflict so much as it exposed underlying racial conflict. And I always feel that when you talk about race, you have to understand that as far as I have been able to determine in my years of life, you see how I played that, Marquise? You see, you learn when you get to my age, you're gonna do it too. Is that I think white and black Americans just have very different expectations when it comes to racial discussion, and had very different expectations. And we're just now talking about Democrats and the few liberal Republicans left, the ones who voted for Barack Obama, was that I think that for a lot of white America, Barack Obama's election was about, if not eliminating racial conflict, it was about healing the past racial conflict and demonstrating the progress of the country and bringing the country together and sort of bringing that to a close. Whereas for African Americans, it wasn't about eliminating that conversation. It was about illuminating that conversation. And I think that because black people live in race all the time, whether you're walking through a store or whether the police are pulling up behind you and you're getting a knot in your stomach, whatever you're doing, you're living your race all the time. Whereas for white Americans, you may live your ethnicity sometimes. Like if you're Irish American, there's like a moment where you're like, yeah, Irish American. It's that holiday that's about you, but you don't live race all the time. And so I think that you just have very different expectations, and neither is wrong. They're just different. And so I think that when African Americans discuss the past, it's cathartic for African Americans and can feel accusatory for white Americans. And Barack Obama was kind of perfectly positioned to be the first black president because he truly understands both sides of that dynamic, having been raised in a very white context by a white Midwestern family in Hawaii. But at the same time, living in black skin has its own set of realities. And so he lived blackness as a human being, but he grew up really understanding and being steeped in what white America feels and deals with and understands. And so that's why he could give that Philadelphia speech and have both white and black Americans go, oh my God, this guy really gets us. Because he does. He really does. And that's a special thing. And I think that only someone like him could have been president of the United States. And when I talk about the rules, what I mean is that black politics has a certain meaning in this country, and it's a limiting meaning, meaning that if you have a majority black district, you can talk race, you can do race talk all the time because your constituents have needs that they understand are race based, and so that's what you do. That limits your rise. You can't become Cory Booker or Barack Obama or a statewide candidate hardly even and talk explicitly about race. It makes it very difficult. Think Jesse Jackson, right? He can't be president because he was doing very specific, not just race talk, but poverty talk, LGBT talk before it was something that was mainstream. So it limits you. And I think he was not limited in that way. I don't know if that answered your question. Was there this? Yes.
Yes. So I agree with you that from day one, Barack Obama was just subjected to this incredible obstructionism by the Republicans. And it's just become ingrained in our politics. I mean, clearly there's a racial underpinning to all of that. But to what extent do you think that's become part of the new politics? And do you think that a first woman president would have a similar kind of backlash? Or do you think it would be ameliorated if there is a white man who gets elected next?
Yeah. Oh, I think no matter which, first of all, I think that I thought at the time, my husband is here somewhere. There's my husband. Hey, husband. At the time that the primaries were going on, I was doing radio at the time, and Jason, my husband, and I used to have this conversation, and I think we both agreed that whichever Democrat got the nomination was going to be president. There was just so much going on post-Bush administration, so much, disappointment. The economy was falling off a cliff. So either one that got the nomination was going to win, in my opinion. And I think had it been Hillary Clinton, we would now be into our 6th year of vehement anti-woman rhetoric and sexism and all of the detritus from Clinton hatred and Clinton paranoia, and it would have been ugly just in a different way. And I think if Hillary Clinton becomes president, it will be ugly in that way. I think that women have had a fight of their own that's unique, and I think that African Americans have had one that's unique. I just think that we're a country that still has stuff to work out. The first gay president is going to have stuff, right? We have issues, right? So the first Latino president, God forbid, Donald Trump, if he's even in the country, is going to make that person's life hell. He's going to make that person's life a living hell. So we have issues, but we have issues because we're the only truly multiracial democracy. If you go, where my husband's from is from England. If you go to Europe still is like a salad bowl, not a melting pot. You can come from the Middle East and have been fourth generation Moroccan, but you're still a tomato. You're never a part of the salad. You're a tomato, and your kid's a tomato, and you never get mixed into the soup or into the, for my analogy to work, everybody has to be a vegetable. But Europe is just different. They don't let you be French. You can't be French. You're a Moroccan forever. You're never French, right? Whereas American, you can come in from wherever, and you can just be American. You can be Bobby Jindal and be like, Indians? Who? I don't even know who they are. I never heard of them. What do they eat? What are they like? I don't know them. And you can submerge yourself in an American identity. We're the only country that can do that. But that comes with baggage, especially when the way that one particular group got in the soup, got into the melting pot, was through slavery, something we don't talk about. Most Americans don't really truly know the depth and detail of, right? We were talking about that earlier today, that if you really can't confront the horror of what we did as a country to start this country, and the horror that underpinned everything, all of our economy, the shipping economy in the North was tied to it, not just the cotton economy of the South, all of it, Wall Street, everything. We just built our country on that. And then when we finally freed the slaves, we kept importing more poor people to do the work. So you have waves and waves of immigration all tied to economics. So we just have issues we haven't worked out. So I don't even remember what question I'm answering, but anyway.
Thank you kindly. I have a question regarding a moment that happened in the primary in a conflict between Hillary and Obama. In May of 2008, Hillary made an allusion to the assassination of Robert Kennedy several times. And I was a strong Hillary supporter and Bill Clinton supporter pretty much my whole life up until that point. I was wondering, are there some conflicts in the world of race that you sort of cannot come back from? And now that we're in a time when Hillary will most probably get the Democratic nomination, how do we address that comment, which to me was a devastating comment?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to ask one more question, but you only have to answer one of the two. Or you don't have you can answer whatever you'd like to. In the first midterm election, it was pretty clear that the Congressional Black Caucus did not know what to do with Obama. At the time, he was really focused on his health care plan, but the country really needed jobs. And I was of the opinion at that point that really what the black community needed was its own think tank, a place where we could work out our ideas, understanding that we're not black politicians, but in the context of the broader community. And I was wondering your opinion on that as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very good questions. Okay, so really, I'll try to be brief now. The first one, I think what happened with the Clintons is that you had in Bill Clinton in particular, almost a feeling of personal ownership of the Kennedy legacy. Bill Clinton revered John F. Kennedy and wanted so badly to be draped in the mantle of JFK that when the media began really alluding to Barack Obama as almost a young Jack Kennedy, when the Kennedy family drifted toward Obama and not toward Hillary, I think that in addition to Barack Obama blindsiding them by running, they didn't think he was going to run, and then blindsiding them by succeeding against her and sort of taking away what they thought was hers and her turn and her time. But I think the Kennedy thing struck a particular chord in the Clintons because they were so married to that legacy, that those comments were unthinking and thoughtless. I don't think they were intended to be racial. I don't think they saw themselves as saying things that were racial, but I think what they said was received racially by African Americans, because again, the two different ways that we talk about race. And so there are just certain third rails that she touched and he touched. And by the way, another thing that I go through in the book is the fact that a lot of those comments that were made in New Hampshire were made after Barack Obama shocked them by winning in Iowa, and truly for the first time jeopardized her hold on what she thought was her nomination. And they were made in one day. They were all made in one grueling day when the Clintons were campaigning from early morning, when one of her supporters introduced her with a comment about JFK being assassinated and was sort of rebuked and spanked by the press. But you remember one of her supporters got on stage and introduced her with something like that, and then she was commenting on it. And then they just kept making mistake after mistake as they got more and more exhausted, and I think more and more sort of desperate. So I think they made all these mistakes, and then they just rippled through South Carolina, and it got away from them. And so I think that I don't think they meant those comments racially, but I think they definitely said them in desperation, and I'm quite sure if they could go back, they would not say any of them because they didn't land very well. Even the ones that were factually accurate, like about the taking a president to sign legislation, but it just seemed dismissive and saying Obama is MLK. No, he's not running to be MLK. He's running to be Lyndon Johnson, right? You can't say that you're Lyndon Johnson and he's MLK. You're taking him out of context. So that's the first one. On the second one, I think the Congressional Black Caucus, and definitely in the research for the book, this came through very loud and clear. The CBC didn't really know what to do with Obama because and it was partly because they come from what I talked about earlier, black politics. Black politics is a very specific thing. You're you're on the south side of Chicago, or if you're Maxine Waters, you're in, the heavily black district in LA, although she has a lot of white constituents too, but you're able to say to them very specifically, I understand the police are doing X, Y, and Z. We're going to do something about that. I understand you have economic needs. We're going to try to get some money to this program and that. And it's very specific. He wasn't doing that, and he wasn't going to do it. And no matter how they tried, they couldn't get him to do race-based solutions. And at the same time, if they hit him too hard, they felt they were emboldening and empowering his worst opponents, the people who were carrying Hitler signs and witch doctor signs, and the people who were totally obstructing him on the other side. They didn't want to empower them. So they were kind of caught where they couldn't do what, for instance, the Dreamers have done, which is to go after Democrats and hit them and hit them and hit them until they get what they want. And they couldn't do what the LGBT community did, which was literally to threaten to defund the Obama project in the first year and a half that it existed if they didn't do specific things on Don't Ask, Don't Tell and DOMA. That, the Obama administration was like, why is the left coming after us? Well, that's how you get stuff. That's how you win. And black people haven't been able to do that for a whole bunch of psychological and weird reasons. And so I think the lesson is, if these other groups are using the tactics that black civil rights leaders honed and perfected, you might want to use them too. And Black Lives Matter, I think, is the first time that you're seeing a majority black entity in the civil rights vein really go after Democrats and go after liberals and go after the administration. And you know what? That works. That's how you get stuff. This
Hi. Oh,
Hello.
Can you all hear me? Hello. Hi. You kind of actually gave a segue into one of the questions I was going to ask. It's Black Lives Matter related. But first, I would like to say thank you for actually, first of all, writing this book.
Thank you.
And highlighting it. And I really appreciate from the passage, the nuance and attention that you put to the difference in age and generation between Holder and Obama, and also how they were socialized, how Eric Holder came from a majority black environment, and how Barack Obama was raised interracially, et cetera. Because I think that plays into the context as you clearly outlined. Into their leadership styles and how they relate policy-wise to those things, which brings into my question. And about the continuation of the Black freedom movements, which I believe that Black Lives Matter is a continuation of the same freedom movement that we've been on for a very long time, and how we as young Black millennials who represent this, whether or not I'm officially a part of Black Lives Matter or not, I'm a young Black millennial in this country, and this is my movement, and I want to know how better we can move forward in owning that collective political agency to aggressively agitate and speak to power but also have that tangible change handy.
Right.
Like what you gave examples from how the LGBT movement worked, and I'm, as an LGBT individual, I'm familiar with, how large bodies like the HRC have funding, etc., to be able to say, look, we've got this millions of dollars, we have this collective bargaining here,
Right.
we're not going to back you, right? But when you have a consortium of young, debt-laden postgraduate,
Right.
want to be continued graduate
Right.
persons, that type of money talks,
Right.
right? And so when you don't have you're easily dismissed, and so all you have is your physical body and your
Right.
agitation and your gumption to speak loudly truth to power in ways that aren't politically acceptable. But the expound upon that, because you talked about
Right.
that in your thing, in your book. I mean, how do we? We're a generation that likes to speak truth to power, right? We don't have the same political nuances that the larger, older generation has. Like the old black politic, the younger generation, we don't really care for that.
Right.
We like to be blunt and frank and call a thing a thing.
Right.
Call
Right.
racism, call white privilege, white privilege. We say those words actively. And so how do we bridge that gap and integrate into the system?
Yep.
Yes.
That's a great question. So here's the thing. I am really fascinated by Black Lives Matter, because I'm glad that you called it a continuation of there's been a freedom movement. There's been a Black liberation movement, or whatever you want to call it specifically, for a long time. And what's really fascinating is that it's almost always been galvanized around the issue of policing. If you go back and look at the vast majority of the riots that took place in the 1960s, they were sparked by a police officer kills person X. There's a belief there won't be any justice for it. Riot. It's as Martin Luther King said. It's the language of the unheard. It's despair over policing has produced a lot of the problems we've had, mixed in with economic want. Those things they're around for a long time. And we should also understand that on the issue of politeness and movements, Dr. King was not considered some great racial healer. He was demonized across the country as a racial provocateur who was only looked to as the preferred leader of the party because of the existence of alternatives like Malcolm X, right? Where they're like, we don't like you, but we like you better than him. So we're going to go with you, even though we don't like you. I'd cite some polls, Gallup polls from the 1960s in which George Wallace has far higher approval ratings than Martin Luther King Jr. That's just reality. So I think that for the Black Lives Matter movement, understanding that it's not a new thing, that confrontation within the Democratic space and in the liberal space is not a new thing. SNCC, which was in a lot of the same position as Black Lives Matter, they were the young kids who were dependent on SCLC and the Kingian movement for money. They were constantly, I don't know how many letters I read in doing the research for the book, letters of SNCC having to write to Dr. King and write to his movement for funding because they didn't have any money. They were 20-somethings. They were very radical. John Lewis is an urbane congressman now, but he went to the March on Washington to tell off John F. Kennedy. He didn't go there to support the Democrats. He went there to literally dress down the president of the United States and say that he had failed Black America and was letting people die. That's what he wanted to say. And it took the older members of the movement, the labor union members, and some religious leaders who said, we'll pull out if you don't make him change it. So you had King making him change the speech. So you had a lot of times this sort of issue of young, more brash movements that are more in your face and want direct action bump up against not just the party they prefer, but also they bump up against older, sort of more urbane parts of the movement. So I think for Black Lives Matter, number one, every single person that calls himself Black Lives Matter should be registered to vote. Because you can't have a movement that doesn't have access to the mechanism, the only real mechanism for power, right, which is elections. So and right now, someone pointed out to me recently, there is not a single national voter registration movement taking place on the left. I think probably Republicans are, but there's not this is the first time. So go back really quickly to Jesse Jackson when he was a much younger man, when he was about in his early 40s. The two presidential campaigns he ran were movements. They were never expected to necessarily get the White House, but these were movements. These were voter registration drives that swept across the South. This man won 13 states, not because he was doing traditional politics. He was doing a movement. And it physically changed the Democratic Party by changing its demographics. You have to make voting and voter registration a part of any movement, and you have to encourage people to take the power and the passion and go to the polls with it, because otherwise you're just, you can't. Oh, and you have to. that didn't go anywhere. They said vote or die. Nobody voted. But yeah, people didn't vote. And then the last thing I'll say, I mean, Diddy, he had the shirts and people bought the shirts, but people didn't necessarily do it, right? And the Obama campaign had that feeling of a movement, and people galvanized by it because it felt like a movement. Of course, later people felt disappointed because they thought more, that miracles would happen. But so you have to be realistic, know that miracles don't happen. Politics is slow and painful and horrible. But you'd have to register to vote, and you have to ignore the calls for politeness, because movements don't have to be polite in order to be successful. They have to be persistent, and they have to be consistent, and they have to not get tired of being told no until they get told yes. It works for almost everyone. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Best of luck. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Thank you for being here. I'm a longtime fan.
Thank you.
I'm going to try to word this clearly, but how do you see the role of the media in moving the race discussion forward, and kind of in self-policing, and how the coverage, especially like with the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, you see the difference of coverage of white people finding food versus black people looting. So how do you see the role of the media in sort of self-policing the language around how they discuss like the Black Lives Matter movement and just race and racial politics? And then as a bit of a follow-up, in the last 8 years since we've had the Obama presidency, what do you find is the most hopeful change that we've had in like media coverage of racial politics?
In media, okay. Thank you very much for that question. Dangerous question. Is the camera on?
It is always.
Just kidding. So I think. Thank you for your question. I think the media, as it's constituted today, is almost not built to properly handle in-depth and weighty discussion. It's just almost not built that way. In part because it's so atomized that no one is consuming the media. They're consuming whatever media is preferable to them. There's a thing that's happening in media where, for a lot of what people are consuming, they look for what intrinsically feels right, and then they look for the outlet that will say that, as opposed to just getting the information and then feeling something about it. It's backwards. It's like upside down. And so because you can block out and freeze out almost anything, that's what you wind up with, right? And so the Trayvon Martin case becomes either a young boy being killed, or a vicious would-be serial killer being, taken down and the rest of us saved from him, depending on what you watch. And so it's very hard for the media to get around that issue. The Black Lives Matter movement is an interesting case where the media follows where the discussion feels like it's going. So that when Black Lives Matter is first coming up, it's like, this is an interesting movement. Let's put DeRay McKesson on, and let's talk to some of these bloggers that are on. And then when you have a entity, let's say police agencies, say Black Lives Matter is an anti-cop movement, it's causing police to be killed, we're going to cover that. And so then the discussion is Black Lives Matter a racially divisive movement that's causing police to be killed? We'll talk about that after the break. Like, you know what I mean? We're just following. So, and just posing that question is kind of conceding the question. So I think it's very hard. I think a lot of us in the media try really hard to have context and nuance, but we're just almost not built for it anymore. We don't have that kind of media, except a few things. There's still really a lot of great, really rich, nuanced conversations in media, and a lot, especially in written media. There's still a lot that's great. It's just, do people seek it out in general? I don't know. As far as what's the most hopeful thing to come out of the last 6 years, I think the fact that it's actually hopeful, even though it's been painful, I think it's a hopeful sign that the country in general understands that we do need to close this wound of race, and that wherever we come at it, I think people do understand it. I think we are having a needed but painful conversation. I think that's actually a good thing. And I think the fact that we're addressing some of the really long-standing causes of the problem are good. I mean, we're seeing real progress on issues of law and order and policing, real progress on rolling back the drug wars, which are awful. I think more and more Americans have finally kind of broken this spell that, Wall Street has some magical formula that's good for the entire country. That maybe we do need to think more about that, think more about income inequality. I think people are really thinking more about these issues and willing to take more action. So I think that's good.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm
Hello.
going to try to, I'm nervous too, so
That's
I'm
okay.
going to try to keep it together. So if you can tell by my accent, I'm not originally from D.C. I'm from a place in North Carolina, in eastern North Carolina, which a lot of people stay there and they don't ever leave. I got out as fast as I could. And one of the things I love about D.C. is that you're exposed to not only different races, but you're exposed to people from all types of different cultures, countries, areas of the country. I mean, it's just awesome. And I think everyone should have that experience. Sadly, a lot of people do not, and they live in their bubble, and that's what happens for them. And actually, where I'm from, there's 100 counties in North Carolina, and my county, there's about 7,000 students in public school, and they are actually being sued right now by the NAACP because we have 3 separate school districts for 7,000 kids, and 2 of them are over 90% black. And what frustrates me, the last couple months especially, I've wanted to delete Facebook and pretend like I didn't live there ever in my life, because I get frustrated that, yes, I haven't lived my race every day like you guys, but I have empathy, and I think I'm doing you such a disservice by pretending like it doesn't exist for you. And so as a person who is with these people who say it's racism doesn't exist, but you call people they, them, this, that's a really big pet peeve of mine. How do you encourage people, or how do you bring up that discussion to encourage people to have empathy and say, just because you choose to not acknowledge it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a difficult question. We all have that relative that at Thanksgiving just says things and you're just like, how are we related? This is crazy. I can't believe you think that. And we all have that. I think that the thing is that there's certain things that can only be accepted coming from someone you love. You know, I think that people talking across the table or across the racial divide or across now the partisan divide, which is even more vehement and hardened in even than almost the racial divide is, it's very hard for people to accept anything coming from the other side. There was a Pew poll that showed that more people than ever before believe that members of the other party are a threat to the country. That's what people, if you have to characterize them, are they just wrong or are they a threat to the country? More people think that now. So we're so divided that it's very hard that those kind of discussions, if it's your friends, are best coming from you. And I just think that we have to be brave enough to confront our own friends and family when they're saying crazy things or when they're saying things that aren't factual, just correcting basic facts about things. Because I think really the reason Facebook is so powerful is that the research has shown that people will listen to more coming from their friends, even if they're not physical friends, even if they're virtual friends, then they'll accept it almost anywhere else. So I think you have to just be brave enough to bring it up.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Is there one on this side? Yes.
I'm wondering, what role does Hillary Clinton play in your book? I see her.
Yeah. Hillary. So it's interesting. So I seesaw back and forth between the Clintons and Obama, but in the very earliest part of the book, it's really more about the Clintons and really a lot about Bill Clinton in the early part of the book, because what I really believe was happening in 2008 in some of those really harsh back and forths between the two, they were kind of fighting over the 1960s and over the legacy of the 1960s. That's why I started the book there, and fighting over what the Democrats have long struggled with, what to do with the legacy of Lyndon Johnson. Do we kick it aside because it hurt us with middle class and working class white voters? Do we embrace it? Do we want to be that liberal anymore? What do we do with the Vietnam piece? So I think that was part of the struggle that was happening between them. So a lot of what I talk about in the book about the Clintons, number one, is sort of where Bill Clinton's political ethos came from. Because if you'll remember, Bill Clinton really got into the National Party in a big way in the late 1980s, when the question was, how do we recover from the LBJ era? Not how do we embrace it, but how do we bury it? Whether it's regarding Vietnam or really the war on poverty, which had become so demonized at that point. The party had been so McGovernized. It was seen as too liberal. Jimmy Carter ran as a conservative to say the party is too liberal. I'm going to run as a Southern religious conservative, born again, Bible believing Christian conservative. The ABC, Anybody But Carter movement I write a little bit about is because liberal Democrats thought he was too conservative, even though he's thought of as a liberal. So Bill Clinton comes along, and his remedy, and a lot of the new Democrats' remedy, was we need to take this party and add a little dose of what Richard Nixon did, which is we need to be the tough on crime party, because tough on crime is a message that resonates with the suburbs. And Bill Clinton was a part of the movement that wanted to do that. And then they had other ideas about who would actually be the guy who ran on it. But he was bold enough to say, I'm going to be the one to be the champion and run on it. And he ran on it. And one of the things that he did to demonstrate his seriousness about it was to rebuke publicly Reverend Jesse Jackson, who had been the star of the 84 and 88 sort of movements of liberals and African Americans. The nation endorsed him. He was also the champion of liberals. And he's like, I'm going to rebuke him in front of his own people. And then I'm going to rebuke Mario Cuomo by name in media interviews. And I'm going to set the left aside. And Bill Clinton was so successful in doing that he then artificially raised expectations among the supporters in the New Democrat Party that when he got in, he was going to stay that way. But then he started doing inconvenient things, and he gets in and he tries to fulfill the promise he made on LGBT rights with the military, and he gets just slapped down mercilessly for it, to the point where he was sort of pushed back to the right. And he tried to do some things that were in a more liberal vein, but he couldn't. And once they lost that midterm, you saw the Clinton administration steer that ship to the right on certain things, especially on crime policy, that the party then has to live with after Clinton. But Clinton's a complicated and interesting character because he's also a guy who's so conversant in speaking with African Americans and so comfortable that even as he's passing the crime bill and welfare reform, he's still revered as the first black president. He can still go to any pulpit, any black church in the country and get on the pulpit. And if any of y'all know preachers, I don't know if there are any religious people here, preachers don't let you get on the pulpit. You have to sit in the front row and be acknowledged. They may acknowledge you, right? We got some church people, they may say, you can stand for a second and not, they sit down, they don't give you the mic. But he can, he just has this sort of magical thing. So he's this weird duality with him. Now, Hillary Clinton is neither one of those two things. Hillary Clinton is a very intriguing character to me because in her sort of character study in the book, she's somebody who's made the most changes in who she is. Hillary Clinton starts out as this teenage sort of conservative, like almost like Alex P. Keaton on Family Ties, right? And then, except for the family's also conservative, so that actually is not a good analogy. And then she becomes this really liberal, feminist, really crusading liberal lawyer in Arkansas. And then she becomes first lady, and the message she's given from the media and from everyone in politics is, no, you can't be that. You can't be this crusader who's trying to have policy, be in charge of policy. You can't do that. You have to go back to being a traditional first lady. So she keeps having these permutations of herself where she has to keep changing her persona to fit into the politics of the day. So, my kind of thesis is by the time you get to 2008, you have these two people who have both gone through so many permutations of their character, of who they have to be in order to succeed at what they're doing. And then they clash with each other, but some of their problems are kind of the same. Barack Obama has to decide how black can you be to be president, and Hillary Clinton has to decide how much can I be a woman candidate, and how much do I have to be a candidate who's a woman. So I find them really fascinating because the three of them are very much alike. And it's ironic that they became such competitors when they have so much in common. So Hillary Clinton is in the book a substantial bit because she also has some moments when she demonstrates more ability to speak frankly about race than Barack Obama does. There's a part in the book where I talk about her relationship with Stephanie Tubbs Jones, the late congresswoman, who was like a great friend of hers. They were really tight. And Hillary goes to Delta Sigma Theta's annual convention, which is a major black, these Deltas, I'm gonna want to be Delta, so hey, I was broke in college, so I'm not she goes to Delta Sigma Theta and just electrifies the room, and people are yelling, "Run, Hillary, run." She has this incredible ability, and even after things like Ferguson, Obama's hamstrung, she can just be frank. Because she just has, as a white woman, she doesn't have that baggage. She can just say things. So I kind of contrast them in that way and sort of the ironies of what that meant for her. She's a fascinating woman. She's a very interesting character. We don't get to see a lot of her because we kind of only talk about her email server, unfortunately. So we should talk more about her. She's interesting. Okay. Yes.
Last question.
If Hillary wants to be more spontaneous, she should just take lessons from Bill. It's the simplest thing to do. Anyway, when Rand Paul first got to Washington in 2010, he made some suggestions that he thought the Civil Rights Acts of '64 ought to be reconsidered because maybe they shouldn't apply to small businesses and things like that. And Mitch McConnell was asked about that, and he said that he was an aide to Senator Thurston Morton, a real name from out of the past, and he was proud to be on the Senate floor when that bill passed. And we're not going to go there, he said. You think Obama should have called him up and said, "Good for you"?
Oh, that's interesting. I interviewed a lot of people who really lamented the fact that that President Obama does not pick up the phone more and just call people in general on the Hill and just sort of.
He wasn't part of the civil war.
Right. He's a younger man and wasn't, there for that. But yeah, and that he didn't do more of that sort of personal glad-handing. Bill Clinton, that is what he lives for. Bill Clinton, this would be 8 hours long if Bill Clinton was doing this, because he loves to talk to people. He loves people. Barack Obama's he's like Hillary. They're very similar. They're very sort of closed. They're not like naturally ebullient people. They're just not into all the glad-handing. And to your first point, Hillary Clinton can't just be Bill Clinton. She's just not that lady. She's not that spontaneous person. I think that she's been so constantly reversed in who she has to be that it's almost like no matter which person she decides to be, she's just beaten up for it. And I'm not sure she now knows really what to be sometimes. I can't speak for her. I don't know her, personally like that. But I think Hillary Clinton's dilemma is she can't just do Bill Clinton. She can't just do that. That's not her. She does. She has to do her own thing and find out what her own thing is. And I think she'll figure it out. She's running for president as herself, and she can't run as Bill Clinton. Or Barack Obama.
It's ludicrous for her campaign to be mulling over how can she be more spontaneous.
Yeah, when you're asking how you can be more spontaneous, you've already done something wrong. So they need to figure it out. And so anyway, thank you all very much. I think we are out of time. Yes. I'm sorry. I'll talk to you afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending.